Hi, Vic.
Hey, Jane.
How you doing?
It took us 4 hours to rehearse that.
Yeah. No rehearsals.
First of all, I'd like to just thank everybody for coming. This is a great group. But I want to thank Janet McCarthy Grimm, who looks like a woodland sprite tonight, and the fabulous Andy Hughes, without whom we wouldn't be here. And Peggy, thank you so much, and everybody here. And, as I was looking around, I thought, all of you people should come up here, and Jane and I should sit in the audience, because you've all got stories and great stories and publishing stories and they. So I'll just say a couple of words about Jane and our friendship, which goes back to the time of Noah. And I was thinking about this. I came to Knopf 1,000 years ago, and after I was there, I think a short time, I was at the famous Aunt Ruth's, and she said, and there was the great, I remembered her name, Aunt Minna, who said, there's somebody at Knopf that is related to you and who I know, who obviously she knows. And I said, who is that? I didn't know who Jane, at that point she was Jane Becker. I didn't know who she was.
Jane Becker. Wow. That is the time of Noah.
I don't exaggerate. And so anyway, Jane and I met her, and she was wearing, I think you were wearing your little white tam o' shanter. I may have just exaggerated that. And Jane was in publicity, working with Bill Lovard, and the famous Bill Lovard, and cutting to many, many episodes. I will just say this one story, that at a certain point, Jane was Miss Publicity, and I was in the editorial department of Alfred A., what I call Gesundheit, Knopf. And Jane said, in all seriousness, that she was going to be on the cover of Time magazine, and she was going to be Woman of the Year. And I just walked out of the office howling. However, was I wrong? She did not appear on the cover of Time, nor was she Woman of the Year formally, but in essence, in publishing land, she was on the cover of Time, and she was Woman of the Year, and set the place ablaze. And we have been friends. Our lives have crisscrossed, and we are of different ambitions. And I'm sort of blinded by this man's shoes here, who has come from the LA Times, former fashion critic. I think we should all give him a hand, because it takes a lot of courage to walk into a room with those. Anyway, so Jane, before we start having a conversation, I'll turn it over to you, Jane, if you want to say a few words.
Just a few words. I think you said enough. Because I think that, this is a conversation between two friends, two colleagues, two women who have been around for a long time, two women who have broken through many glass ceilings, broken through many glass expectations. And now I hear there's a new thing called a glass cliff, which, if any of you anybody hear of a glass cliff? And I see anybody nodding? Okay, it's really awful. It's the idea that there's a difficult job available, and the powers that be put a woman into that job because they know she's going to fail. And that is, well, there you go. So there you go. But anyway, so we're here today. It's love. I feel like I'm a little bit at sales conference. Somebody just said that. Philip Turner just said it's like sales conference. It's not quite like sales conference, because I don't recognize a lot of people in the room. And by the many years that I spent at Knopf and Harper, I would recognize more. But we've talked. We've done this before. We've talked. We feel it's very important for women and for men as well. What we are talking about has to do with achievement. What we are talking about is how you set your sights, and then how you go and you get them. And my feeling is, I've been lucky. There have been bad days, but there have been a lot of good days. I've been very lucky, and I've had a wonderful career, as has Vicki. So we just really kind of talk a bit about how we got through all these years together. And I have to say that the first time that I really met Vicky, she was sitting on a couch in our beloved Bob Gottlieb's office, and there was an auction going on for a little book called Interview with a Vampire.
Oh.
Vicky found, I just got a shiver when I say that. Every time I say that, Vicky found Anne Rice at a writers' conference when Vicky was about 23 years old and Anne was maybe a little bit older. And she brought Anne Rice into Knopf. And it became, I mean, as you know, Interview with a Vampire became a classic book. In those days, though, we also sold the paperback rights, which hasn't been done in many years in book publishing anymore. Although, and I'm going to talk about The Circle, it probably will all be happening again as we're sitting in this room. But Vicky was sitting absolutely pale on Bob's couch. I mean, beyond pale. And I walked in, I was just kind of hanging out and having a good time. And I walked in, I said, what is going on here? And she said, there's an auction going on for Anne Rice's book. And the number is at $625,000. Now, I want you to know that at that point, that would have been like $10 million. No books were sold for that price. And here is this editor who is this fabulous editor and not particularly shy, as you can tell immediately, but she was dumbfounded. She was sitting there stunned. What do we do? And that is an image I will always remember because it was such a satisfying moment to know that, number one, you had found her at some godforsaken writers' conference in Idaho?
No, it was Squaw Valley, which
well,
then became quite well.
But anyway, so that's sort of the beginning, and we've led different lives, but they all keep coming together again. And one of the things is that we love publishing, and publishing, I have to tell you, is, in my experience, it's a circle. When we first started in the business, the way you sold books was word of mouth. And you had to spread the word. We didn't have to call people influences or whatever. We just spread the word. And now we've gone full circle and we've done a lot of different kinds of marketing, but it's come back to now it's telling the words, using the words, spreading the words. It's now, of course, we know what it's called. But anyway, so that's just a little bit from me.
And first of all, I was stunned and sitting on that couch because I was thinking, my father was a writer, and I was thinking, here's this first novel that that we've published, and it's made 600 and some odd, whatever it did, and we paid $10,000 or $7,500 for the book. And I just kept thinking of my father who had just died, and how he would feel about this first book that had just made all of this money when he made a living as a writer, but it had such a profound effect on me. So sort of threw me. And anyway, so, you were mentioning, auctions for paperback, for books going to paperback. And, more and more paperback companies that are affiliated with large companies cannot afford to do the books that we have contracted for. And there was a time, as you say, before, for instance, when Sonny and Mehta came to Knopf, we stopped sending books out to be auctioned, and they all went to Vintage, and Vintage had first crack. And then we really stopped selling them because they were all going slated for Vintage. And now if Vintage doesn't want a book, I say, let's sell it outside.
So
to me, it's perfectly natural. Let's just sell it outside. The writer deserves to have a second life. The book deserves to have a second life.
And then the book deserves to live forever in the various formats that now books can live forever. I mean, we're living in a time that you don't have to be a hardcover or a paperback. You can be an audio, and you can be digital, and you can continue to sell and continue to reach people, new people, all the time, which is what I find so extraordinary. So I think when we started talking to each other about how we feel, and when we started bemoaning the past and some of the great times in the past, I say no, they're past. but they are also, we learn from the past and the present is what's so important, but more important is even the future. I was just talking to Kathy Horrigan at Knopf, and we were just talking about that we will celebrate in a year, Knopf will celebrate in a year, the 50th anniversary edition publication of The Power Broker by Robert Caro. We were all there. We were all there. And it is amazing because I just saw Bob Caro in East Hampton, and he was saying, do you believe it's 50 years? Well, when we say that, that's going to sound old to a lot of you younger people in the audience here, but it's not old. It's wisdom that we have to now take this publishing company and kind of have it go, take this publishing industry, have it go around in a circle and come back to the content is what it's all about. Content we must have. I see some people nodding. I don't know if people are in editorial or what kind of places you all are, but it all starts with the book. And that's why it all starts with the editor. So my question to Vicki has always been, why did you want to be an editor?
Well, in truth, it was a fluke. And I think many people, I would say, who go into publishing didn't say, okay, my dream in life was to be an editor. I mean, my father, as I say, was a writer. I grew up around writers, and my parents' friends were in publishing. Janice and Albert Leventhal and George Braziller and people like that who, the Bone-Eyes and the Liverites who lived down the road.
There were real Bone-Eyes and Liverites.
Who lived down the road in Menemsha. And so I basically needed a job. And my sister had gotten a job working for one of my father's agents, the famous Phyllis Jackson. And she was talking to an editor, a managing editor at Simon & Schuster, who said, you know, you're so great. Are there any more like you at home? And she said, well, actually, there is.
She's not quite as great as I am, but anyway, there is, right?
So, and he just happened to be famous, the most famous person. In those days, everybody went to the Italian Pavilion for lunch, and they drank for 3 hours, and then they went back to work. And he was the most famous of doing that. And there I was working at a Montessori school, not knowing anything about Montessori, but there I was doing that. And the woman who was co-teaching with me was a former Playboy model. But anyway, that's another story. And so every day during the break, I would call this guy and see if I could come and make an appointment. And of course, every lunchtime he was out at the Italian Pavilion. Anyway, somebody canceled one day and I got him. He said he'd hired somebody, but to come in, and he hired me. And, you know, I couldn't type and I couldn't spell, but it worked out.
And the interesting thing is, so you see, so that's where she wound up working with an editor. I graduated from NYU and walked into the personnel department at Random House. It wasn't called Human Resources then, it was called Personnel. I walked in and I was, you know, a little bit haughty, 21-year-old, and I said, I want to be a publisher. And the head of personnel looked at me and said, you know, there are steps that you have to take before you become a publisher. And I said, well, fine, but, you know, I want to be a publisher. And that was exactly it. And I started and I was hired. Vicki spoke about the famous Bill Lovard. Bill Lovard kept me waiting an hour for an interview to be his assistant. Now, in those days, you sat there and you waited and waited and waited, and out comes this man who resembles Albert Camus, who he wanted to. And I know I've made this up, but I think a Marlboro cigarette was kind of hanging out of his mouth. And he said, come on in. And anyway, we started to talk, and we talked for about a half an hour. And he said, the job is yours. And I said, what do you mean the job is mine? Don't you want to see any other people? And he said, Jane, I have interviewed 21 other people. The job is yours. So I said, going back, well, what is that job that we're talking about? And he said, well, you can be the publicity assistant. And I said, number one, what's publicity? I mean, this is a long time ago. And number two, why would I be an assistant? I have a degree in English literature. And he said, because that's what I'm offering. And I did my first negotiation. I said, I'll come to work here as your publicity assistant for 3 months. And at 3 months, you make me publicity associate or I leave. And of course, the rest is history. So anyway, it was truly one
Now,
of
wait a
those
minute. That's an
moments.
interesting thing. I mean, why? Well, let's go back because I have a question for you. Found out you were working at a financial company during college, and we know you were always good with numbers. And when you were doing that, did you want to be in publishing? I mean, your father was a graphic artist and painter, and your mother was a model, and Jane's mother was also the former Miss Subways.
My mother was actually a Miss Subways, yes, a long, long time ago.
But did you want to be in publishing?
I had two thoughts. I wanted to be in either finance or in publishing. So during the summer before I was graduating from college, I worked at a company called Value Line Securities, and I absolutely detested it. So it said to me, if you detest that, where are you going to go? I said, I'd always had it on my mind that I wanted to be in publishing. I would be in publishing. That was it.
Okay, but do you remember this? This is your life.
Really, I mean,
this is your
is
life,
someone
Ralph.
Walk through the door. This is my life. Okay.
Did you remember working in the Foreign Rights Department typing contracts?
That was when I was a temp. I did that before I got the job with Bill Hubbard. Yes, I did.
How did you hear about the job with Bill?
Because the personnel department knew what I wanted to do.
They knew you wanted to run the company.
But when you say that's right. That was exactly right. They knew that was it, and I was going to wind up running it. But yeah, that's interesting. Funny.
Are you impressed that
I'm really impressed. But are you impressed that I remember you walking into the office wearing, hold on, everybody, jodhpurs.
Jodhpurs.
This woman rides horses. As we like to say, she came here riding a city bike. I came here with a car and driver. And there are some other things around.
Okay, so my next question is
BFFs. Yes.
Okay, so my next question is: you were at Random House, Knopf, for 29 years as a publicist who became executive vice president of Alfred A. Gesundheit, publisher of Vintage, president of Audiobooks, and then wait a minute. So talk about starting audiobooks and what.
Well, audio is really quite an part of the industry, as we know. And it was 1985 that I walked into Bob Bernstein's office, who's the man who was the head of all of Random House Inc. And I said, I have this great idea that's going to make us billions of dollars. And he said, what is it? What is it? Patting me, a little bit of a Me Too moment, and that we don't talk about. And I said, I want to start an audiobooks division for Random House. And he said, what's that? I said, I want to do audiobooks. There's one man in California named Duval Hecht, who has a company called Books on Tape. And he licenses rights from us for $100. We never see any more money. And he's producing audiobooks. And I said, I think that we, as Random House, as the #1 publisher, we should start an audiobook division. I will be the founder and the president. And give me a chance. And he said to me, looked me straight in the eye, and he said, if Bob Gottlieb says you can still do your job at Knopf, I will let you start this. And so I did. And as we know, what has happened to the audiobooks business, and right before Bob passed away, Bob Bernstein, I bumped into him at a screening, and he said, I owe you an apology.
Film Forum.
At the Film Forum.
Right.
He said, I owe you an apology. And I said, what's the apology? He said, when you walked into my office and you were this cute young thing, again, a Me Too moment, but I didn't mind at all. Anyway, and that's another whole thing, Janet, to do. All right. But anyway, he said to me, I owe an apology. He said, do you remember you walked into my office and I thought you were out of your mind and you wanted to do audiobooks and you said it would be $1 billion business. And he said, lo and behold, it became $1 billion business, and you were right and I was wrong. And I thought it was a very big moment, very big moment. Yeah. So tell me about some of your books that have changed culture.
Well, there was Anne Rice, who, when I read Interview with, I said to Bob, I'd like to go to a writers' conference. I was working with Alice Adams, who was a novelist and who was a New Yorker writer. And she had a house in Truckee, in Tahoe. And she said, there's this writers' conference. She was going to be speaking. Why don't you come? So I said to Bob, I'd like to go to this writers' conference. And he said, "You'll never find anyone at a writers' conference."
There's always that wonderful negativity on the part of Bob Gottlieb, which we
No.
adore.
But he
he's
said,
always
"But go."
hanging
He
around.
said, "But
Right,
okay, go."
right.
So, I found my way from the biggest little city in the world to Truckee, and there was Bob McNee's house that was right out of a Ross Hunter movie. And we were having anyway, so there was Anne. That's a whole long story. And so there was Anne Rice. And when I read the manuscript, I thought, this book is answering it's addressing a lot of things that I haven't. It just was sort of wondrous in all that it encompassed, but particularly in its ability to capture the feeling of the outcast, of the outsider. And it was such a particular moment. So we published it, and it took really the culture about 12 years to catch up to it. And so there was that. And then, at the other end, I just published a book by Suzanne Simard called Finding the Mother Tree. And she was the forester who proved that trees communicate with one another. And when that proposal came in, I said to myself, there's no way that we are not publishing. Be prepared, gentlemen, we are publishing this book. And, it was an interesting moment. And I wonder if you've had to go through this, or other people in the room have, because it was a really interesting moment. And I said, because I had been aware of it previously in other auctions. And I said, this one is going to be different, because there comes a moment in an auction where you choke and you say, it's too scary to go any further. And the guys who are behind you, who are doling out the dough, have also choked, only they might not call it that. And they say, no, we're not going to go. And I just said, I'm going to barrel through this. I'm going to push through this. I mean, there was an amount that I wasn't going to go higher than, but I was going higher than what had been put forth, way higher. And that was a big moment, because I when you push through something like that,
You're talking. Now you're going into the push through, and that's exactly what we are talking about with younger people who are now going into publishing and going into other businesses too. I mean, we got everything that we're talking about can actually relate to other businesses. It's not only to publishing. It's knowing what you want to do, and as I said before, and going after it, and just pushing and not letting anybody stop you. This, of course, requires a lot of confidence on the part of the people who are working this way, and it's not easy for everybody to do what we're saying that we have done. I mean, Vicki not only has pushed through the ceiling on the editorial front, but Vicki also is a writer, and she has a best-selling book, biography of Barbara Stanwyck. Volume 1 has come out. Volume 2 will be coming. This is a woman that edits all these fabulous books and also writes books, and also finds the time to, ride horses. I mean, it's really pretty miraculous, because as we know, most of us in publishing, it's really a very full-time job. I mean, you do work round the clock, and hopefully everybody in this room is in a position where he or she is happy with what he or she is doing and is looking to go to the next level. And we'd love to hear from you when we do some questions and answers.
But Jane, there's something interesting about that, going to the next level, because again, I was thinking about this while I was swimming this morning, and that is that I learned a major corporate lesson, or a lesson about corporate life, very early on when I got to Knopf. And that was that when I got there, Danny Okrent was an editor there, and Danny was doing what we did then twice a year, which was to produce the Knopf catalog. And he would write, people would write the copy, and then he would do the layout, and et cetera, et cetera. And I watched him do this, and I said, thank God I'm not doing that. I mean, I was a baby. I was new. I didn't know what I was doing, but I watched that, and I said, thank God I'm not going to be doing that. Okay, so Danny left. And guess what happened? Bob said, do you want to do the catalog? And of course, it's a corporate, it's corporate, it's the way corporate works. You say, yes, of course I want to do it. And there I was, and I did it and produced 2 and 3 catalogs every year for like 15 years with in conjunction with Nina Bourne. However, I learned so much.
And Danny Okram was probably laughing from across town, right?
But here's the thing. It's like because this is where we sort of diverged. And again, I was thinking about this, where you went, ascended, and then you ascended to CEO-dom, and then you went off to form Open Road, and all of the, we're going to talk about all of those different stages. And, there I was, and I was not ascending in that corporate way, but I was buying more and more books and publishing more and more books and publishing a wider, because I have a very wide interest of what I was publishing.
But I could
And so,
not, I
and so
could
that's an
not,
interesting
it
difference.
isn't, yes, it is, but I could not have done what I did if I didn't have the content coming from people like you.
Yeah,
Because
but
even though my strength has been in business, I did, from being credited with inventing the author tour with Julia Child many, many years ago, and watching Julia's eyelashes burned on a Bunsen burner in Denver, Colorado. It was very funny, and having her almost cut off her arm on the David Letterman show. But I mean, I just kept building from one level to the next within the corporation, because I was more focused on that. I was focused on that side, and that side, you do rise up in publicity. I mean, we have someone here who's very high in publicity at Knopf, Mr. Nicholas Latimer, and I don't even know what your title is now. Whatever, he's head guy, right? He does the catalog. But the truth is, as Vicki said, I mean, I did go from something to something to something to something as I was going up the ladder to get into the C-suite, which is where I knew I wanted to be. So there was either a C-suite at Knopf, Knopf is very unusual, and there was never really a C-suite.
Well, Knopf was fixed for a long time.
But I was whatever.
All right, well, wait a minute. So now that you brought up publicity, let me ask you this question, because I
Yes.
know that you have many, many funny, insane stories,
insane
apart
stories.
from all of the tours that you were overseeing. So let's talk about a few of them.
Well, I talked about Julia to begin with. Traveling with Julia Child was like nothing before, and no one had ever done a tour like this. We worked with, in those days, department stores had book departments. So we would have her do a demonstration in a department store, and we'd see the lines of people, hundreds and hundreds of people coming to get autographs of her book. Think about that as today. Doesn't work today, but that was amazing. Working with Lauren Bacall and having to close Fifth Avenue with the police department, because she was doing a book signing at then a Doubleday at 57th and 5th. And literally we had to close Fifth Avenue because of the amount of people that came. And then there was going to the Nobel Prize with Toni Morrison. Not a bad gig, I'll tell you. I worked hard, and I worked hard with Toni, but going to a Nobel Prize, I hope everyone in this room who wants to do it can go to that kind of ceremony, because it really is amazing. And there are just too many. I mean, there are just.
Did you do a tour with Tom Tryon?
Trying to get Tom Tryon, the actor turned author. He was a very tall guy, and I had to get him into a private 2-person plane to go for part of a tour. And there I am at the airport in Philadelphia, literally pushing him into this plane and getting his legs kind of wrapped around his neck. Yeah, that was Tom Tryon. Yeah. Crowned heads, yes.
Among many other things.
The other. Yes.
So it
just went on and on. I mean, I was there for 29 years. It seems like it was yesterday. And it seems like it was 5 years or whatever. And then, of course, HarperCollins had its own thing. But at HarperCollins, by the time I got there, as into the C-suite, I was moved a little bit away from content, but tried to push myself back into it. And I was known as the publishing CEO, and the CEO who went to every single party for every single author, no matter where, because I always felt if that author gave his or her time to write a book for us, I'm going to turn up. And it got to be a thing, oh, look, Jane will be here, big deal. But the thing is, for me, it was a big deal, and it was a fabulous, fabulous.
Do you remember
time.
this story that you? It was a great story that you said, where you, when you got to HarperCollins, and I said, what were the first things that you did? And you called CEO Alberto Vitale and said, how do you become a CEO? And he
What do you
said,
do?
call me in 3 months and you'll know what a CEO does.
Well, it's hard to define what a CEO does, but the one way to define it is that you're the one who is responsible for the bottom line totally. And your CEO, your CFO, that's it. So if it doesn't work, the heads roll. And if it does work, you can then expand and do whatever, but within that category of chief executive officer.
So you know what, there are a lot of people here, and what I think we should do is to open it up for questions, and then Jane and I will go back and forth. So does anybody have a question?
Did Random House Audio precede Harper and Rowe's acquisition of Cadman?
Yes. Random House Audio Publishing was the first. The only thing that Alberto Vitale, who was just quoted and who's a great friend, said that Bantam started it first, because they started it at approximately the same time, putting in a man named Richard Sarnoff to be the head of audio. But no, it was Random House Audio Publishing was it. Yes, first.
When were the moments you remember going from asking for permission first, rather than just going and doing something, to just going and doing something?
When I was 22, I was at Simon & Schuster working as an editorial assistant. And that was in the Dick Snyder days. So you can imagine what that was like.
A lot of people here don't know, but he was the toughest person in publishing.
He was your basic tyrant.
Nice.
He was not Mr.
Pop.
He was not Mr. Popularity.
Right.
And basically, it's a long story, but basically, that wasn't working out too well for me. And anyway, I'm not going to go into all that. And so Michael Korda called Bob and said, we have somebody here. Will you go? And I left Simon & Schuster and went to work at Knopf as an editor, and I was 23. And that was the end of it. I mean, I wasn't even asking permission. It was just, going through where you're asking somebody who is the head of the house, I want to buy a book. That is just part of what goes with the territory. But in terms of asking permission, I said this to Jane about a week ago, and I was saying I was never really like that, because it all comes down to mother love, where I was raised to be a certain kind of person. I say I was raised to be a prince, and my sister looked at me and I said, but that's true, where I could do anything I wanted to do. And it wasn't that there was never, okay, the expectation, you're going to get married, you're going to have children, so sit down and be quiet and wait your turn or whatever. That was just not who I was.
But we had the mother love in common. I mean, my parents said to me from the time that I can recall, you can be anything you want to be. And I listened to that every night. You could be anything you want to be. So I don't know, Janet, when I ever stopped asking permission. I didn't ask permission. When the author tour started, I didn't ask permission. I figured out that there was a budget and what we could do. And the author tour exploded. I mean, it really did start with Julia Child and exploded.
Yeah, but Jane, do you remember that you did this? This was like a major fissure at Knopf when Jane, the publicity department was publicity and promotion, and Jane, not asking permission, and decided, and you can talk about how you came to that. There came the moment where Jane said, okay, publicity is over here and promotion is over here, and I will be promotion and you, Bill Lovard, will be publicity, and never the twain shall meet.
And Allison Lazarus has to remember this happening. I mean, that's what happened. I just started working with authors and media. At Knopf, authors didn't do media, and not that there was a huge amount of media to be done then, but the Today Show.
They were most of the authors were dead,
and a lot of the authors were dead at Knopf. But there was the Today Show, and a couple of other things. But what there were reviews in the New York Times Book Review, And Bill Lubbard was absolutely superb at that, as did Nicholas Become. And in fact, there's a funny story. When I got to HarperCollins, I said, "Where's our new front cover New York Times wall?" Knopf, of course, we had a wall that had all the front covers of the book review. And at Harper, they laughed at me. They said we had 2 last year, so they didn't do it. But that I didn't ask permission. We just naturally grew apart. And I started what then became the promotion department of Alfred Knopf rather than the publicity department. In most publishing companies, they were together, and perhaps they are still together. But yeah, but I know the permission thing. I don't recall. Not for me. Not for me.
Anne Rice is my favorite author, and you say you found her. How did you convince the publisher that her writing would sell?
She was a storyteller. And Bob Gottlieb was great editor-in-chief. And I mean, one of the first books I brought I didn't bring it from Simon & Schuster, but it was such an un-Knopf book, but it was decades ahead of its time. And Bob let me publish it, which was a book on menstruation and menopause. And this must have been 1972.
Right, yes, exactly.
But he let me do it. And because he is a genius at letting people go and letting people fly. And so he saw what it was, and he said, yes, because that was, and this has been this way for decades through Sunny Mehta. It's a house that was, and through Sunny, a house that is editorially run and run on instinct. And as everybody in the world knows, the only thing you really have going for you is instincts and trusting them. And so that's how that happened.
You talk about pushing through. Was there ever a time when your instincts were wrong or when pushing through didn't work in your favor?
Oh, many times. So many times.
That's part of the game. I mean, the truth is that if you're looking for this great content and you're looking around, and of course you're going to make mistakes.
But when you say make mistakes, I mean, we could publish books that, I thought were great and that they didn't work then. But for instance, I'm not saying it was a piece of great literature, but it was a moment, and it captured a moment. And that was that in I don't even remember, 80 something, I published, or through those years, I published a woman called Eve Babbitts. Now, Eve Babbitts was just republished in the past 5 years, and she's now become, she's called, not by me, but she's called iconic. So, it didn't work then. It worked now. And sometimes you have to wait. Sometimes as I said, the culture with Anne wasn't ready for 12 years. It really must have been about a decade before it really caught up to her. And then I said, oh my God, what have I wrought? But not because of the writing, just because where it was taken in the culture.
But it is very interesting about Eve Babbitts because it's been a total renaissance for her. And I think that as long as you're in publishing, people in publishing, you will see books that will come and go on their initial publication and may do a little bit better if they come out in paperback. Now, of course, if they come out electronically, may do even better than the others, all of them together. But sometimes it doesn't happen. And it takes, as Vicki said, I mean, the Eve Babbitts thing really struck me because she was right at the moment that we published her, and then she didn't go far enough. And then somebody found her, and she came back, and the time was right. So again, it was the belief. I don't know who her editor is now, but it was the belief.
She's no longer alive, and but they republished the books that I published. But here's another thing. Think of all the writers who were so huge. This is a fun conversation to have. Think of the writers who were so huge that aren't read anymore. I mean, it's.
Or who might be. May I ask about Open Road?
Yeah.
And the announcement today of Relit, which is nice.
Yeah.
And Rediscovery. We talk about discovery, rediscovery.
Okay. Well, for any of you who don't know, after I left HarperCollins, which was in 2008, I started a company called Open Road Integrated Media. The notion being that we would take all backlist books because the rights, the e-rights for those backlist books were with the authors because it was not in the contracts until 1994. So I went out and made a land grab and had backing and started this company, Open Road Integrated Media, all for backlist. And what we did for backlist was just unbelievable. And it was enormously successful. The company was sold. I'm out of the company. And they are now doing, they're not the company that I created, but they are now starting something new again with a concept of digital publishing.
And the seed you planted allows them to grow.
That's,
in these
thank you very
ways.
much. Yes.
And I met you, Jane. I worked at Kodansha America, and we had the Kodansha Globe series. I think you knew my boss, Asatella,
Yes.
and that was a rediscovery series. We called them revivals, not reissues.
Right. Right.
And
And with us, we just called them books and at Open Road. He said we just called them books, not backlist. We did some frontlist, but my goal was all, as you say, planting that seed for taking backlist and bringing it back to life. And that is a great pleasure. I have to tell you, when all of a sudden, you know, an author who has really not, William Styron is a perfect example. And he was one of our first writers. And I was accused, I think, on the front page of the New York Times of stealing the rights to the Styron. Well, not true. I mean, the Styron rights were with the Styron family, and we brought out all of those books, Sophie's Choice, Lie Down in Darkness, et cetera, et cetera. And in the realm of Jane and Vicky, Vicky is about to publish Rose Styron's autobiography. I introduced Vicky to William Styron's widow. They hit it off as I knew they would, and that book is going to be coming out from Knopf shortly.
June 13th,
June 13th.
Beyond This Harbor.
So there you go. So that's another thing. So beautifully produced
Andy
by
Hughes.
Andy Hughes and the team.
Yes. Well, you mean talking about hybrid working? Well, I like that idea. I think it's great because there are people who can't afford to live in the city.
Oh, I don't think she's talking about.
Aren't you talking about that?
You're talking about. Oh, okay. Sorry.
I mean, I think it's great. And some aspects of various jobs, it's good when you're in the office, but I mean, I think it opens everything up. And
we disagree on this. I think it's very important.
Okay, well, let me just say this about
Okay.
Jane. Jane had her babies and was at the office the next day.
Not
So does that put it into perspective?
Not quite the next day, but I did go to the recovery room first, and then I came to the office, right? And those two babies are just fine. They're big babies. I think that part of publishing, part of what we learned, part of how I grew up was opening the mail for my boss. Of course, there's no mail anymore. Going to the water cooler and getting him water or coffee or whatever, and basically talking to people every minute of the day that we would bump into each other. I think there is nothing like it. We didn't want to do this as a Zoom. We wouldn't have done this as a Zoom. We want to look into people's eyes. Now, being realistic, the industry is shrinking and expanding in two ways. I thought you were going to talk about that. We are seeing that there will probably be 4 major companies rather than 5 because Simon & Schuster will probably be sold shortly. But what I loved is Poets and Writers, the organization, which all of you should belong to because you should be reading not only their newsletters, but getting their magazines, recently had an issue that said there are something, my number is wrong, but it's close. There are something like 379 publishers in America today. That is really, to me, that makes me feel so fabulous because when I started in the business, there were many more than 5 major publishing companies. I mean, I remember I always talk about Peanut Butter Press that was out in Seattle. I mean, there were small companies that existed when I first came in. Then they got gobbled up. Well, now it's all starting again. And I think that's what makes publishing so exciting today is that there is the room. And I'm amazed I'm amazed when I see another publisher here, another publisher there. I think it's absolutely great. And I think that, not to disagree with Vicki 100%, I do think that there are jobs that can be done at home, but I do think that being face to face is an extremely important part of our business in particular.
Well, face-to-face is important, and you do get a lot out of it. But I also think it's important to open up the walls and allow people who don't have access to come into a business that has been very limited to who's there. And I think it's important. Anyway. So that.
Since we disagreed on that, we better go to.
But but wait a minute. I will say this: at the same time that this business is shrinking, and there are all these publishers that exist, and the New York Times doesn't sell books anymore. The reviews in the Times, and you hear. At the editorial meetings, you hear these people, hitting their head against the wall saying, what's going to grab the attention? What's going to grab the attention? At the same time, I'm riding my bike across 50th Street, Rockefeller Center, and I see this huge, gorgeous McNally Jackson store that's just opened that is like so fancy.
And hopefully will survive.
And in the middle of the most expensive real estate, and it's their flagship store, and Barnes & Noble has just, it's a business, you know what? It's a business that is exactly like the world, that's contracting, expanding. It's going in opposite directions at exactly the same time.
Right. Absolutely. Unique in many ways. You're very welcome.
Thanks for the question. Come back again.
Yeah. Are you raising your hand or you're just brushing your hair? Right. Okay.
Have concerns about marketability ever gotten in the way of your ability to be an editor or publisher?
That's a pretty touchy subject. I will say that it has been only in the recent past, and the recent past could be 20 years, that marketing made decisions. At least not where I worked or where I ran. Now, maybe that happened in other companies. I don't know, but where there were smaller teams and they all work together. I think now that that the world has changed and that TikTok is really where you'd better be, and are the marketing people dealing with TikTok, or are the publishing people working with TikTok? I think that marketing is having a much bigger say in what is acquired. And I think that in some ways, I love that idea. I'm a marketer, so I love the idea of having the marketing input. On the other hand, I believe that the acquisitions should be coming from the editorial side. And I think that the editors bring the marketing people in, but I think the instinct has got to be editorial.
But, somebody who's making the decision to buy something, I'm living in the culture. So I am as much a part of the culture as anybody else, as the people who are marketing this. And I'm thinking about why. For instance, I published this book called Designing Your Life, which was not, again, it was not your sort of typical Knopf book. But I had a connection when I read the proposal, I thought, it was a book by these two guys who taught at Stanford, who had this very successful, was one of the most successful classes on how they were industrial designers, and they took the principles of industrial design and applied it to how to change your life and how to figure out what you want to do. And they taught this as a graduate course at Stanford. And what was great about it was that the proposal was that people want to change, I thought, but they don't know how to change. And this book gave you permission to do that. And so I thought, this is needed at exactly this time. I felt that. And, we bought the book, and it's never been below 1,500 on Amazon in the 8 years that I've published it. It sold, more than 500,000 copies. And, but the point of it is that, I saw something in that was going on in the culture of the moment. And that's what you really have to respond. You trust that.
But then that book, of course, can be republished every time, every graduation, every June, that book has to be republished, Designing Your Life, every New Year's. And I believe that actually Knopf is doing a good job doing that.
Well, even though they really don't do that much on its own, people find that book, and every January and every June, that book has its sales, and it will forever.
Did that answer your question? A little bit? Not totally, but a little bit. Okay. Another question? Yes, here we go.
First, as publishers evolve to fully or partially remote workforces, what are your thoughts on working in person versus in an office setting? Is coming into the office important? And second, should New York remain the center of the book publishing industry?
No, absolutely. I mean, yes. That's who we
I've been at Knopf for 50 years, and I was just,
think about that.
who can imagine
Yeah,
it? Who can imagine it? But it's true. It's absolutely true. And for many, many, many years, it was the town that time forgot. But I will say this: when I'm working on manuscripts and when I'm working with writers, it is a completely blissful job. It is a total education. It is a constant education.
The other day,
it's
Vicky
great.
said to me out of the blue, I love what I do. And I think she always has loved. I mean, we've had moments when, she probably hated with the person she was dealing with. I've had moments. But the fact is, yes, we are two women who love what we do. And we're able to take passion and turn it into success in many ways. And we're very proud of that.
Well, before Peggy gives us the hook, we'll take one more question and then we'll go on our merry way.
Are agents the gatekeepers of the book publishing industry?
I don't know that agents are so much the gate. Are there any agents in this room? Martha and Philip. Okay, you tell me if this is wrong. I mean, maybe here are the two exceptions, but most agents live in fear of being fired and act out of that fear when they're dealing with their clients. Oh, yeah.
Okay, there goes one agent saying.
Martha, all right, wait a minute. I'm sorry, Peggy. We need the room for another hour. Martha's coming up here.
I do think there has been a shift over time to where now agents are an author's primary and sometimes only contact with the book publishing industry, whereas that might not have always been the case. Would you agree?
Okay, that's Martha Sue Kaplan of the Kaplan Agency, who I first met at Alfred A. Gesundheit 50 years ago. And then Martha left Knopf to go and ascend into New Yorker land and run it with Bob Gottlieb. So that's the Martha Kaplan story.
I forgot that already. My goodness, the New Yorker.
Do you mean to say that agents live in fear of being fired by their clients?
Well, you deal with the agents that I deal with, and they are terrified of their clients.
I've held a lot of jobs in the book publishing industry, and I don't think agents are terrified. The toughest thing for me is finding a way to give a book the time it needs to be successful.
Look, the reality is what's happening in publishing houses now is that it's all, it's the dollar and the money, and it's harder and harder and harder and harder for everybody from the top all the way down.
Okay, that's what the top publishing companies. That's why I'm saying that we're in this wonderful place of having 400 publishing companies out who may not pay up front the advances that had been paid before, but will go and really go after selling those books. And that's what I am so encouraged by. Everybody thinks, well, I want to be published by Random House, or I want to be published by Knopf, or I want to be published by Simon. No. I want to be published by ABC Press in Phoenix, Arizona, who is going to think that my book is the greatest thing, and they're going to really put all their effort behind it. And now, since books are for sale, if you touch the button of Amazon, I mean, you will be able, I am so encouraged about publishing today. And I think that's what I hope to get across.
All right. Well, on that note, a perfect note to end this wonderful evening. Thank you all for coming. It was great. You're a great audience.